Welcome everybody. Today I'm talking about a project we've been involved in over the last few years. This is actually part of my research masters, which is just coming to completion now. And the title is Measuring the Recovery of Coal Mine Rehabilitation Following Fire Using Remote Sensing and Ground Surveys. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on the project, Peter Erskine, Stuart Finn, Vanessa Glenn and David Dolly. So in terms of the presentation today, I'll give you a brief overview of the project, introduce the study site and the study design, then give you some results of the transect assessments, the remote sensing assessments, and I'll sum up with some key findings and also introduce some future research. So is fire a threat to mine site rehabilitation, or is it perhaps an opportunity to move some of these systems into desired trajectories? We know that fire is an inevitable part of the Australian landscape, so at some point these sites are going to be impacted by disturbances such as fire and drought. And all stakeholders really need to have confidence in the future that these sites are able to cope with such disturbances. So the broad aim of this project was to apply an experimental fire to establish rehabilitation and then assess the response and the resilience dynamics in the 2 years after the burn. So within that broad aim there's a number of objectives. We wanted to understand fire behaviour and how the fire severity and intensity impacted on the future vegetation response. We wanted to use transects to characterise floristic changes in 2 years following the burn, and we also wanted to look at the broader scale, so look at the landscape scale or the block scale and use remote sensing methods to generate fire severity and then look at recovery maps in a similar time frame to the transect measurements. So the site itself is located in central Queensland. There's a little insert map up there on the right hand side. It's an interesting site in that it uses two different site preparation techniques. So the first technique is where they cover the reshaped landform with 100% topsoil and seed a variety of trees and shrubs. And this, because of the characteristics of an invasive grass called buffel grass in central Queensland, tends to become a buffel-dominated grassland community. The second rehabilitation technique is where they use topsoil and put it in 10-metre wide strips along the contour and alternate that with bare spoil. In the spoil they plant trees and seed trees and shrub species and then understorey species in the topsoil sections, and this tends to return our open woodland ecosystem dominated by acacia species. So this particular block actually used those two different site preparation techniques. So I used historical imagery to look at the topsoil spreading patterns, and also this image to segment out areas that were grassland and open woodland. Within each of those communities I randomly allocated 5 separate transects. So just in terms of the burn itself, it was conducted in the early dry season, so it's May 2015. Low fire danger conditions, 27 degrees Celsius. They ignited the site using drip torches along a perimeter which was created using a dozer in the days leading up to the burn. The burn itself, we tried to mimic wildfire conditions, so it was a 120 hectare block. And we started up on the leeward side, so it was a backing burn, but then we moved around to the southern side and let the wind actually move the fire behind it with the frontal fire. So we ended up with a mosaic of intensity and severity impacts. I'm just going to jump to the transect assessment results now. This is a photo looking down the transect which had the highest ground fuel load of buffel grass. And so this, forgot to mention before, this site is 20 years old, so it was established in 1994. And you can see in the top right hand corner I've got a biomass, understorey biomass, tonnes per hectare chart. So biomass on the y-axis, on the x-axis is months post-fire, and that red line is the timing of the fire. So the time of this photo was taken, this was 12 tonnes per hectare. Just as I go along, sorry, the acacia just up in the... I'm going to show you a time series, so just have to keep an eye on that acacia salicina, the sally-wattle just up here. So the fire itself obviously removed a large part of the, quite a high combustion rate of the ground fuel load there. We came back 3 months post-fire to do another monitoring event. You can see a small bounce in the biomass chart there. The buffel tussocks are starting to resprout. 3 months after that, so 6 months post-fire, this is the end of the dry season. You can see some of those buffel grass tussocks are starting to hay off. There's that sally-wattle in the photo there is starting to resprout from the base. 1 year post-fire, so this was after the first wet season we came back, and biomass fuel loads are now back towards halfway pre-fire levels. And then a year later, which is 2 years post-fire, biomass fuel loads are now back to pre-fire levels. And you can see that that acacia sally there is actually taller than what it was pre-fire. And buffel grass, it's actually incredibly resilient grass. So this photo is taken 3 months after the burn, and it's already seeding quite prolifically across the site. And when you look at biomass averages across the whole site, you can see that grassland areas had a much higher fuel load compared to open woodland areas before the fire. Then in the 2 years after the fire, it's bouncing back towards pre-fire levels. So 2 years after the fire, grassland is actually, there's no significant difference between pre-fire levels. Open woodland areas actually have a significantly higher ground fuel load. In terms of species richness, there's 3 plots there. Just have a look at the left-hand side one at the moment. On the y-axis we have a number of species, and months post-fire on the x-axis. Again, the red line is the fire. So all species, native and exotic, there's a general trend of increasing species richness over time, and it's significant for both grassland and open woodland areas. When you break that down to native species in the middle and exotic species on the right, the main driver is native species contributing to that increase in species richness. These green lines are actually, we looked at a range, a historical range of values for species richness. So we've been monitoring the mine site rehabilitation for about 10 years. So we went back and looked at some unburnt transects and looked at the range of values that we would expect to find on unburnt rehabilitation on the site. So even though that trend is significantly increasing over time, it's still falling within the range of what we would expect to see on the mine site rehabilitation. That's not what we see here though. This is tree and shrub density. So there's 4 plots, 4 graphs there. So I've separated this into height classes, so less than 2 metres, 2 to 5 metres, 5 to 10 metres, and then greater than 10 metres. Stems per hectare on the y-axis, and months post-fire again on the x-axis. The big story here is with the less than 2 metre height class. So following the fire, we had a massive regeneration suckering event from the acacia species that were on site. And this is actually, when we look at the green lines, it's actually moving beyond what we've measured on the site before. So those green lines represent 145 transects over a period of about 10 years. So within that period, there's quite a range of seasonal occurrences. So it's a pretty good understanding of what we're seeing from the fire is a shift in the structural component of the system. And at the site at the moment, that's 2 years post-fire, this is what it looked like. We have a lot of dead, mature acacia stems, and underneath there is a bunch of suckers and seedlings coming through. Just moving to the remote sensing component of the project, and this is WorldView 3 satellite time time series imagery. We captured pre-fire, post-fire. You can see in the post-fire image the fire scar, and 12 months post-fire and 24 months post-fire. And in terms of the multispectral imagery, we used an index called Normalised Difference Vegetation Index and generated a fire severity map. At the top there you can see there's classes of high severity, low severity, and that's actually unburnt in the top graph. And you can see that almost half of the block was burnt at a high severity, and that actually corresponds with a lot of the location of the grassland areas where there was a continuous fuel load and the fire was able to move through those areas. And also those areas, a lot of those areas were impacted by the frontal fire as well. So from the south, it was the frontal fire pushed it through the rest of the block. Then if you look at the 12-month post-fire, we've got two recovery maps, 12 months and 24 months post-fire. So 12 months after the fire, 50% of the site's showing high regrowth, and 2 years after the fire, that's now jumped up to 62% of the site, and that also corresponds with those areas that were impacted at high severity. So some of the key findings then, and so rehabilitation method has an effect on fire intensity, fire severity and recovery. Some of those high fuel loads from buffalo grass, when they're unmanaged, they can actually become quite a high risk for the site. Within the bounds of the study conditions, the rehabilitation is actually showing resilience to fire impacts, bouncing back to pre-fire levels, and we saw that in the transect assessments, but also that was supported by the remote sensing assessments as well. Worldview 3 as a satellite sensor using multispectral imagery, able to map fire severity and also fire recovery as well. So this site is one site in central Queensland, and we've been able to secure funding to now roll this project out essentially to a number of other sites. We've already burnt a site at Newlands coal mine, which is just inland from Mackay. We did a night burn, which is when this photo was taken. We're trying a few different new things as well. We're using thermal imagery on a drone to measure fire rate of spread and validate some of our observations on the ground. And we'd like to get an understanding of the variability of mine response to fire, understanding that even though this project showed a very successful response to fire, we'd like to see the variability in central Queensland and also southern Queensland as well. So that project's going to be going over the next 3 years. I'd like to thank those people for helping out in the project. Thank you. Seasonality, I think that's a really interesting question. So that vegetation responsible for tree drop density will probably change if the fire happened later in the year at the end of the dry season. And I think the reason for that is because of the water in the subsoil. So that suckering response is indicative of quite a bit of available water on the wet season, essentially. If we did that burn at the end of the dry season, we may well not get as much suckering from the acacias. And I've spoken to another person who did a burn at the end of the year, which was a really hot burn, and they actually killed the same species of tree with not much suckering. So that's what's yeah. So I think we would get a different response. We would would like to try that in the next number of firms we're doing. So you're looking at seasonality and how that impacts on results. Yep. Right.
Had fire been a treatment previously, like when you had that range of species?
No.
So that was a real outlier by putting fire on the range.
Thank you, Phil. So next we have Andrew Butler from National Resource Assessments in Cairns. Funny enough, I actually interviewed him by phone about 18 years ago, and
Yes.
Anyway, he's going to talk about collection criteria for flattery.
What he didn't tell you was I had to pick up one of his old jobs. So I'm going to be talking about developing completion criteria for post-mine landforms following silica sand mining. I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors, Susan Walker and Tim Anderson. So I'll just give a quick outline of the talk. I'll give you some site background, the regulatory context and drivers for the project, some project aims, the approach we took to developing rehabilitation objectives and completion criteria, and I'll probably refer to those as performance targets, some outcomes of the rehabilitation assessment that we conducted, and a quick summary. So this work was conducted for Cape Flattery silica mines. They operate a silica sand mine within the Cape Flattery dune field north of Cooktown in far north Queensland. The coastal dune field contains an unusually diverse range of landforms. It's one of the few places in the world with extensive, large, elongate, active parabolic dunes, and the Gegenwald, hopefully there's no Germans in the audience, so excuse my German pronunciation, the Gegenwald ridges at Cape Flattery are amongst the best developed in the world. So I'm going to just move to the pointer. These are the Gegenwald ridges here. You can see those V-shaped landforms. They're actually developed as the dunes retreat. So they form in the deflation areas. You can also see some of those large bare parabolic dunes, and also note the influence of the southeasterly wind on the landform formation. So silica sand mining actually removes the majority of the resource. So unlike mineral sand mining, which some of you may be familiar with, it creates remnant landforms and very few dunes are actually backfilled with reject material. Topsoil and vegetation is stripped and either direct placed or stored. And the mining is a fairly simple operation using front-end loaders and conveyors. So following mining, the sides and the final mining face and the floor of the mine area are reshaped before being revegetated. So rehabilitation commitments were developed initially in the 1990s and formalised through the preparation of an Environment Management Overview Strategy, or EMOS. That EMOS was prepared through a consultative process involving the mine, traditional owners for the area, government agencies and conservation groups. So it was groundbreaking at its time, and it's probably still a rarity. So there was strong stakeholder ownership for the commitments that were made. The EMOS committed Cape Flattery to undertake research to characterise and protect the natural values of the area and to develop rehabilitation performance targets. Unfortunately, before that process was completed, there was a change of government department responsible for environmental management in mining, and legislation changed at the same time in the early 2000s. So those EMOS commitments were replaced with environmental authority conditions that at Cape Flattery set out rather ill-defined or unachievable in some cases outcomes for both landform and vegetation. I'm just going to be talking about landforms today. So that lack of realistic, effective performance targets has hindered effective rehabilitation planning. It's prevented the validation of rehabilitation progress or completion in a regulatory sense, even though good progress has been made. And it's created uncertainty regarding the rehabilitation financial liability now and at closure. And for the economists in the audience, there's at least one. That ranges either from a current liability, potentially of hundreds of thousands of dollars, to a closure liability in the millions. It will also prevent Cape Flattery from seeking rehabilitation certification from the state government to reduce their financial assurance costs, so their pond costs. So Cape Flattery Silica Mines therefore commissioned us to review the rehabilitation objectives and completion criteria and sought options from us to address these regulatory issues. They haven't been under great regulatory pressure, which has only added to the inertia. So we wanted to review current state rehabilitation policy, even though it's changing rapidly. We wanted to revive some of those past EMOS commitments that have been lost and examine literature developed objectives, indicators and completion criteria. And we also wanted to develop rehabilitation performance assessment tools and validation methods that were easy to implement so the mine could actually do that for themselves without employing expensive consultants like me. So we redeveloped the rehabilitation objectives for the site based on those EMOS commitments as far as we could. We reviewed all the landform mapping information that was collected in the 1990s. It was pretty extensive. There were 19 landform types recognised, 15 of which occur in the disturbance area. When I talk about landform types, I'm talking about small parabolic dunes, large parabolic dunes, deflation areas, things like that. That mosaic of landforms results in 27 different vegetation mapping units across the dune field, and that heterogeneity is considered to be an important characteristic of the dune field. So we also examined landform measures or indicators that might provide a measure of that heterogeneity, allow us to recognise landform characteristics or patterns in the rehabilitated landforms that occur in the unmined dune field, and provide the basis for meaningful assessment of progress towards meeting our rehabilitation objectives. So these are the objectives. So they're sort of stated aims. They don't contain a great deal of detail. The details is in the indicators and completion criteria or targets that are developed. So we wanted to recreate that landform heterogeneity because there's another talk at this conference which talks about that driving biodiversity. We wanted to integrate the rehabilitated landforms into the surrounding landscape by recreating post-mine landform characteristics present in the unmined dune field. We wanted to reinstate the dominant landform aspect, which is associated with the prevailing wind. And we wanted to retain or minimise the disturbance of rare and significant landforms in the dune field. So we've developed appropriate metrics and completion criteria to verify attainment of these objectives. So in terms of looking for patterns in the landscape, we used existing LiDAR data from the site and generated a digital elevation model. We then defined and mapped 48 different landform elements. So a landform element is a unique combination of aspect, slope and relief, and there were 4 classes of slope, 4 classes of aspect, 3 classes of slope and 4 classes of relief. And that's a map showing the landform elements distribution. So you can quite clearly see that it's picked up the dune features. And these are the you've got the different classes up there if you can read those. So each landform element's given a unique code. So we looked at the data that we collected at rehabilitation area scale, so at different scales. So each one of these blocks here is a mining and rehabilitation campaign. And then we looked at domain scale. It'll be familiar to people working at mine sites. That's groups of areas that have the same management. And we also looked at the whole of lease scale. So this was our attempt to look at heterogeneity. So most of the average rehabilitation area size is 4 hectares. So we looked at richness of landform elements at a 4 hectare scale in the unmined area. So that's all these areas down here. And what we were looking for was either a minimum or a typical range in richness that we could potentially use as a target. That failed reasonably miserably. So the graph at the bottom, the blue bars are unmined areas and the red bars are mined areas. So that's we've got the richness along the x-axis and the frequency along the y-axis. There is no typical value, it's polymodal. What we did find was that the average or the median richness was actually similar in the mined and unmined areas. And importantly, what it told us was that high richness wasn't actually necessary at the individual rehabilitation area scale, but the provision of a broad range of richness values was characteristic of the domain or lease, whole of lease scale. So we used that information to develop completion criteria. So we also were looking for common elements. So we examined the distribution of those landform elements within each of the 15 landform types that were present in unmined areas. So we were looking for how much of each landform element occurs in those areas. And what we found, which was a surprise to me, was that 30 of the landform elements are actually common to all 15 landforms. And together they make up 80% of the coverage within each one of those landforms. And also 24 landform elements actually cover 95% of the whole DM area. So at the domain scale, there is a common core of landform elements that we can use as being characteristic of the dune field and the landforms within it. And so the presence of these common elements, again, form the basis of the development of completion criteria. But we also wanted to make sure that the patterns that were there, so we can say all those landform elements are present, but whether they occur in a form which is similar to the unmined area, we didn't know at that stage. So we looked for the relative distribution of landform elements within rehabilitated domains to see if it was similar to unmined areas. And we initially just did a direct comparison, which luckily worked out pretty well. So I've just given an example here. We've got data from a rehabilitated domain and from one of those landform types that occurs in the dune field. And all we did was work out the relative distribution of each one of those elements across the top. I won't give you a small selection here. And just by a quick look at the data, we noticed that if there was an average difference of 1% or less across all those elements, that it could differentiate between a good and a poor match. Now, I haven't done any stats on this, so excuse me. This is just a visualisation of that process. So we've got all of the different landform elements on this radar plot, and the X scale is the relative abundance of all those different landform elements in those, in comparing a rehabilitated area with an unmined landform type. So you can see when we've got less than 1% difference, we've got a pretty good match. Where we've got a greater than 2% difference, the match is nowhere near there. And this is actually an area of rejects, so that's actually a reformed dune, and it's fairly obvious that they need to do some work on actually making that landform more similar to the unmined areas. And in fact, that area has become unstable. So it's a good indication that something's wrong. So talking about stability, we were looking for those northeast, southwest facing slopes. And we actually worked out that they do dominate all unmined landforms. But it wasn't actually as much of a defining characteristic as we thought it was going to be. So it was more characteristic of those landforms which have long, narrow ridges or elongate parabolic dunes, but it was less of a characteristic for small parabolic dunes because they actually have faces perpendicular to that aspect. So the targets that we developed were mindful of this observation. And we also wanted to try and protect some of those significant landforms. Thankfully, some of them are outside of the area where most of the mining resource is. So the largest disturbance, and most of it's to do with access, really, is those elongate parabolic dune heads. And to date, there's been 7.5% of the area that's covered by those dunes has been affected. And Cape Flattery has decided that it wants to limit overall disturbance to less than 15%. And I have no doubt that they'll be able to achieve that. In fact, I think that's probably, they can probably actually, the amount of disturbance is going to be significantly less than that based on the mining path at the moment. So how did we go when we actually applied those criteria? In domains where rehabilitation had been fully implemented, so where Cape Flattery had decided that they had actually in their mind had finished, all the revised landform characteristic all the revised landform rehabilitation targets have been met. So in terms of landform, those areas can be considered complete or successful. Rehabilitation areas that are still active, so where progressive rehabilitation is being undertaken, or where past or current dune filling is occurring. They haven't met all the targets, particularly in the similarity between the patterns of landform element distribution. Just think back to that radar plot, that's a good example of one of those. So those areas are not successful or complete. But the data assessment approach that we've developed will actually assist planning future earthworks, particularly in some of those areas, by identifying which landform elements are underrepresented at the end of mining. So it is possible to go back and repair some of those areas. And as I said, some of those areas are pretty unstable at the moment, so they'll have to do something before they can actually successfully rehabilitate those areas. So just a quick summation. Cape Flattery does not have appropriate performance targets to plan or validate rehabilitation success, and despite obvious rehabilitation progress to date, the uncertainty presents an unacceptable financial risk and liability for closure, and the companies recognise that. So we revised rehabilitation objectives and completion criteria and tested them, and found that in some areas the rehabilitated landforms could be validated as being complete, and other areas require additional work. And a strategy to integrate these targets into a changing regulatory landscape is still required to provide certainty for future actions for the mining company, and that's our current focus at the moment. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So we will move swiftly on to Mitchel to have some more detail on the Department of Environment and Energy data that recently is moving Brisbane.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So, I've spent the last 8 years or so working from Darwin, and I've got to explore some amazing parts of the top end. Recently, last 3 years or so, I've been working for the supervising scientist, and recently we've been looking at setting restoration targets for Ranger Uranium Mine. As Peter said, I'm just in the transition to Brisbane, where I'm looking to start a PhD with Peter next year. So my talk is called Using Data from Drones to Derive Restoration Targets for Ranger Uranium Mine. So I'll just give you some background and context about the Ranger Mine. So it's an exporting uranium mine that's been operating since 1980, and it's set to close by around 2026. So the mine footprint covers an area of around 1,000 hectares, and it's surrounded by mainly tropical savanna in Kakadu National Park. So Kakadu National Park is World Heritage listed, so it has a lot of natural and cultural values, and as such, the mine is under probably a bit more scrutiny than most mines are. So the mine operators are required to restore the disturbed area using local native plant species similar in density and abundance to adjacent areas of Kakadu. And the supervising scientist's job is to advise the Minister upon completion on whether or not this criteria has been met. So we want to go from something like this to something like this. So we're looking at deriving restoration targets. So we're using the SERA standards as a guide. So the SERA standards suggest that we develop a number of metrics to use as criteria. So species composition and structural diversity are suggested among other metrics, but I'll focus on the first two now because they're the most relevant for the initial stages of revegetation. So species composition is about the number of stems per hectare of which species. So how many Eucalyptus miniata, how many Petrodonta per hectare, these sorts of metrics. Structural diversity is so structural attributes like size class distribution of those trees and the percentage cover of the different strata, so understory cover, overstory cover, metrics like that. So how do we actually set these metrics? So the first principle of the SERA standards is to use a local Indigenous reference ecosystem. So a big part of setting up a reference ecosystem is setting up reference plots. So we need a reference plot in Kakadu National Park. So one of the questions when thinking about setting up a reference plot in Kakadu is how big should the reference plot be? Keeping in mind this is tropical savanna. Savanna is a highly heterogeneous environment. So this heterogeneity is driven by mainly disturbance that operates at different spatial and temporal scales. So you've got fire frequency, fire intensity, feral animals like buffalo, and also strong winds that sort of form a bit of a patchwork of the vegetation. So there's been some recent work that suggested that traditional small plot surveys don't account for this spatial heterogeneity and lead to errors in savanna research. So this is a paper that's come out last year by Carla Staver that suggested that we need to focus on having larger plots. So plots are closer to the hundreds of hectares instead of the less than 1 hectare. So in the case of setting up a reference plot or reference plots to derive mine site restoration targets, small plots could bias our metrics one way or another. So it could be too many stems or not enough stems per hectare, for example. So this is just a table that is from the 2018 Ranger Mine closure plan. So this is the current plan that ERA are using to guide their restoration. And so they have average numbers of stems per hectare. This was based on small plot surveys of about 0.04 hectares. You can see they're suggesting 200 stems per hectare of acacia mimula. Like, this might be right, it might be wrong, but it seems high just at a glance, but we won't really know what that number would be across the 1,000 hectares unless we do larger surveys. So we're suggesting that we need to do at-scale reference plots. So at-scale meaning reference plots of a similar scale to the area that needs to be restored. Because it's 1,000 hectares, you can't use traditional ground-based plot surveys, but we're suggesting that we can use drones to do these large-scale surveys. There's a lot of hype about drones at the moment. I think they've been mentioned in a lot of talks already today. This is the time cover from June 2018, the drone age. So this is a photo made up of thousands of drones and taken with a drone. So it's all about drones. So the revegetation and landform group of the supervising scientists has a drone program I've done for a few years, and it's all geared around trying to do vegetation surveys at the largest scale. So we're currently at the early stages of this long-term project, and at the moment we are we're in the process of testing the drones at the 1 hectare scale to see if we can get similar metrics to what we get from ground surveys from the drones. So I'll just give you a run through some of that work. So, as I said, we want to test this technology at the 1 hectare scale, but we also wanted to set up a number of plots so that ground survey data could be used in the interim. So we set up 8 plots using a stratified randomised design. I won't talk too much about that because I think Jay's going to talk a little bit more about that in his talk. So 8 1 hectare plots, and at each of these plots we used the AusPlots rangeland survey protocol. So it's just a standardised ground survey method. And around the same time, at each of the plots, we also flew a number of drone platforms. So for structural diversity metrics, so remember this is things like, we want to get things like size class distribution, overstory cover, understory cover. We flew a LiDAR-enabled DJI M600 to get a LiDAR point cloud, which I think Nick had a lot of those in his talk. He seems to be a bit further down the process than we are, so it'll be good to talk to him later. And for our species composition data, we flew a number of different sensors enabled for imagery with different bands. So red, green and blue, that's just your standard photo, and then that's just a consumer grade Phantom 4, up to a Toughwing UAV mapper, which is multispectral, so it's got red edge and near infrared, and then all the way up to a base spec hyperspectral scanner, which is on a M600 as well. So that's got 100 bands. So the idea of this is to get as much information as possible from the vegetation to try and discriminate the different plant species. So I'll just show some preliminary data. So we've collected this data and we're going through the process of trying to pull the metrics out of this data. So for species composition, this is work that Lorna's done, this is not my work. So this is a multispectral image that's been run through a piece of software called eCognition that does object-based classification. So it can help discriminate different species based on rule sets. So this is actually a different species of tree in the middle here. This is an ironwood, and you can discriminate based on texture, spectral signatures, shape, proximity to other things. So at the moment we're in the process of building up this library of different rule sets to try and identify the different species from the imagery. And from the LiDAR data, this is a video which is dangerous. Seems to work. Yep, so this is about 5 hectare area that took about 15 minutes to fly. So you can see there's a huge amount of information there. You can see a bit of understory. I think this is anthosperm or something in the understory. Clearly make out individual trees. So, so the next step in this process is probably the hard bit. This is probably the easier bit, which is going to be to try and pull our vegetation metrics out of this data. So we're working with Sean Lebeek from CSIRO on this work. So yeah, I've just given you a bit of an overview of some of the work that we're doing. So we're still in the process of pulling our metrics out of our drone data, but looking forward, we want to scale up our surveys to the 1,000 hectare scale so we can really account for that heterogeneity that is in the tropical savanna, calibrate and validate that data at the 1,000 hectare scale, and ultimately publish at scale metrics for species composition and structure. So the good thing about these drone methods is once we've bedded down the methods and the processes, it'll form a really useful monitoring tool. So we'll be able to monitor the restored area against the reference plot, and hopefully that restored area will be tracking towards the reference plot. All right, thanks to everyone that's been involved in this project. Even though we're early on in the project, it's been a huge amount of work, and look forward to more.
Mitchel's been really responsible and kept a very tight rein on this time. So there is time for a couple of questions.
Thing.
Thank you. The first question is the way you said the site. The different site was selected random or based on criteria of such type?
Yeah, so these sites, so what I've framed as test sites for the sake of the drone work, these sites here, yeah, so they were selected based on the Wells land units, based on their landform. So they're all less than 3% slope, undulating upland areas, which is similar to the conditions of the final landform.
So it's more
Yeah, that's right. But it's also worth noting that between these plots there's a huge amount of variability. So even though they're all within that same broad land unit, within the vegetation communities, we just kept finding a lot of new species and huge differences in the metrics from our ground data. That's a good question. So, there's, what's the number, 145? So, there's a lot of species, and we're not going to be able to identify every species. But I think the approach that we'll take is go by the maximum cover species first. So, 90% of the cover will be accounted for by 10% of the species. So we'll be targeting that sort of low-hanging fruit first to see if we can. So we might be able to get 90% of the cover species, but we're not going to be able to get 90% of the actual species. If that makes sense, it might not.
With the rules set creation within a commission, is that just applied to the hyperspectral data, or do you use
That's multi-spec, that one.
multispectral?
Yeah, but it will be. I think we'll use something similar. The hyperspec data seems like a total nightmare from what I can gather. It's, there's about 100 gigs per flight or something, Tim. So.
Maybe one last question.
So your reference area, that's going to be a mosaic.
Yes.
Of different land or different parcels of land.
Yep.
That meet your morphology criteria.
Yeah, I think what we sort of have in mind for how it'll look, if we can do drone surveys at 1,000 hectare-ish kind of scale, is, so that's sort of the traditional method where you say we want 50 stems per hectare, but in reality it's going to look something like that, which is done on Excel, so it won't be exactly like that, but it's a patchwork, so and you're going to end up with a frequency distribution, so I think we'd want our targets to look more like that than having an actual number. That I think for planners like ping might actually be useful as well, because you might have some areas where you can't hit that average number, and you can get 10 to 20, and some areas where you can get 90 of whatever your metric is. So yeah, that's kind of what we have in mind. Yeah, that's not a number. That's just a framework.
Great. Well, if you can join and thank me. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Now on to the fourth talk. And this is by Lorna, who works with me and Mitch and others here at UQ. Go ahead, Lorna.
So I guess Mitch was telling us a little bit about how we want to use drones to assess the understory, or the vegetation in the area. And one of the first steps was to look at what other people have done and how successful they've been in terms of identifying understory species using drones or UAVs, as they're also known. So this work is only a review that we conducted as a first step. Just to get our our background straight, vegetation structure can refer to either the horizontal structure, which refers to the spatial distribution of species. Just think about it as the geographic distribution of species. Or it can be structured in a vertical way, so divided by the strata, which is commonly divided in the overstory, which is the top canopy layer, and the understory, which is everything that falls under that. The overstory generally has more biomass, and it regulates the microclimate, which allows the understory to be more biodiverse, and the understory is also generally more heterogeneous, and it has a greater species turnover. Vegetation is traditionally monitored using field work, but the area that you can cover using this method is rather limited because of its high costs in terms of time, money, and site access. So many have, for many decades now, been using remote sensing, which allows species identification using different characteristics such as their distribution, extent, structure, color, and texture. But remote sensing and its capabilities for species identification are actually limited by the delivery systems and the sensors. When I say delivery systems, I refer to things like satellites, airplanes, and now drones. When I say sensors, I'm talking about the way that the data is actually collected. Sensors can be active or passive, where active sensors are sending a signal down to the Earth, and then it waits for the rebound signal to collect all the data about the different attributes in the environment. Passive sensors are just taking, the environment as it is. And examples of passive sensors are radiometers and spectrometers. These are the ones that are most traditionally used, which are all the images, and it's known as photogrammetry. You can take different portions of the reflected light, and you can have 3 bands, which is the normal cameras that we have. You can have multispectral, which is just usually 5 bands, and hyperspectral, which can go anywhere from 10 or more, like 100, as Mitch was saying just before. So with these things in mind, we wanted to assess the potential of UAVs to monitor the understory vegetation, and we also wanted to assess the feasibility of identifying 3 ground flowering species from their phenological attributes in open savanna using UAV imagery. To do the first objective, we conducted a systematic quantitative literature review using search items that included a combination of either UAV, drone, or UAS, and understory or subcanopy in their different spellings. And then once we got all the papers, which were 18, we analyzed for their attributes identified as standards as the important things in remote sensing. These include things like spatial resolution, spectral sensitivity, spatial extent, and the temporal frequency of data acquisition. I'll be explaining them as I go. So, UAVs are already revolutionizing remote sensing, and they're being used to monitor understory vegetation with varying degrees of success. But the failures can be traced back to inappropriate choice of methods or sensors, at least in most of the cases. In terms of spatial resolution, I'm referring to the pixel size of each cell, and UAVs have a very, very fine resolution when compared to traditional remote sensing techniques. On average, we found on these papers a pixel size of 4.5 centimeters per pixel. In terms of monitoring vegetation, this can lead to the hyperdifferentiation of parts of plants. So you can think of it as you can tell the leaves apart from the stems, from the trunks, from the flowers. So it can get a little bit complicated, or you can actually focus to find some of the some of the attributes that make that species different from others. And due to its fine resolution, it's also very sensitive to errors in the positioning, in the geopositioning. So, with that in mind, it's very important to always conduct ground truthing with high-precision GPS devices and through the calibration of colors and spectral signatures. Spectral sensitivity refers to the portion of the light that is being monitored, and this is the attribute that has remained most constant or most consistent across remote sensing devices. And this is in part because now we have sensors that are small enough that can be carried by the drones. Of the 14 papers that use photogrammetry, 9 of them were only based on RGB data, and they had low classification accuracies. However, others that were using multispectral had 82 and 89% accuracy of classification. Spatial extent refers to the size of the area that is being monitored, and this is perhaps the greatest limitation of UAVs, because if you compare to satellites, where you're actually capturing the whole world, with UAVs we had reported you have reported like 0.8 hectares up to 1,500 hectares. Even then, it's still better than fieldwork. For example, one of the papers that had the most intensive field work, where they did like only half a hectare with field work, where they were actually able to monitor 1,500 hectares using UAVs. The area that is covered is usually limited by the battery life, which depends on the system and the device weight, and usually flights are anything between 15 and 30 minutes at the moment. And another important consideration is that you have to take into account national and international laws to fly these drones, and they often will dictate where, when, and how high you can fly them. Temporal frequency is very flexible with this when compared to other systems. You can fly UAVs very cheaply, which means that you can also fly them at multiple times with very flexible temporal frequencies. This is also an advantage when you consider that you can actually fly them, under cloud cover, which satellites can wouldn't be able to see that through. The only thing is that because the data is taken on a need-to basis, it's limiting the comparative and a posteriori analysis that you can do. Because if you didn't get any data, then you cannot analyze any data. In some forested environments, it's better to use UAVs to monitor understory during leaf-off conditions. So for this, just think of a deciduous forest. When the leaves come off, you can actually see all the understory species that were hiding under the canopy. And the good thing about this temporal frequency is that you can time your flights to phenologically relevant times. For example, when the species are flowering, which brings us to the second objective, which is what we wanted to see how easy or not it would be to find these very small flowers from the ground. And just to put it at scale, the largest of the flowers is the one in the center, and it can be at most 4.5 millimeters or centimeters in diameter. So these are really small ground species. So we were using the Phantom 4 Pro and flying the UAV to collect only RGB data at different elevations from 5 all the way to 40 meters. And as you can see on this image, with a pixel resolution of 15 to 30 millimeters, it was best to find the differences or to pick up the flowers, which are the first two lines. And but when it goes all the way to 89 millimeters per pixel, you can hardly see any of the flowers, which are the two last lines. So what does it all mean? In terms of spatial resolution, we found that it was best to identify understory species when the resolution is at 0.3 centimeters, which can be a problem when, for example, in our case, we can only fly them at 30 meters because of the canopy cover, so we would be missing some of these ground species unless we're able to increase resolution in some other way. But in other environments, some other people have found, have been able to identify species for up to 25 centimeters. In terms of spectral sensitivity, when no obvious phenological differences are available, then maybe you need to collect a wider portion of the light spectrum, and it can also be eased with the creation of a library of spectral signatures and or shapes. For the spatial extent, when you're thinking drones, you can think of two different types, which are the multi-rotors, like the helicopter ones, and the fixed-winged, which are the airplane ones. The advantages of the multi-rotor ones is that they can hover, they're suitable for very tight spaces, and they have greater maneuverability. But the fixed wing can cover larger areas. They're usually more expensive, and they may have lower image overlap, which can be an issue. in some environments. And for temporal frequency, you obviously need to go on a case-by-case basis, but ideally when it's easier to pick up the different things in your environment. But in the end, all of these attributes depend on each other. So they can be modified depending on the needs. For example, you can fly at a higher altitude to cover a greater spatial extent, but at the expense of having a coarser resolution. And with this in mind, you should also be taking a lot of care to select the sensors that are most appropriate for your environment. For example, you can choose to use hyperspectral where multispectral is not enough, or something like that. Monitoring understory vegetation is most useful in most successful in open environments with low structural complexity and low canopy overlap. So these are areas like rangelands, such as the savannas, desert grasslands, and shrublands, also open forests, and deciduous forests during leaf-off conditions. So how does it all apply to restoration ecology? Well, this can be used to monitor the area that is disturbed, to assess reference sites to guide restoration efforts, as we are doing at Ranger, to monitor the progress of restoration across the whole area of interest, and even to measure connectivity of the restored areas with the surrounding environment. And that's it.
Thank you, Lorna. I think we're doing pretty well, so can we probably do one question? No, that's me.
I don't understand, like, if I was to get my phone out and take a photo from here, I could zoom in and I could see a little plant, I reckon, pretty well. Why can't a drone do that in 5 metres?
It can.
Yeah, but not in detail, like certified.
Yeah, it all depends on the capability of the camera itself. So just think about, everybody's carrying at least a 5-megapixel camera nowadays, right? But a few years ago, that was like unheard of, right? Like we were carrying 1-megapixel cameras. So those megapixels is what is giving you the resolution of each of the pixels, which allows you to detect the fine details or not. So, just if you transfer your phone camera to a drone and then you start taking it to different distances, then you're losing that pixel size. So that's why you need to take care of, of how all these attributes are combining with each other to get the best results for your area.
Yeah, at this stage, probably 5 to 10 minutes, you can still see a flower, but beyond that, even at 14 megapixel.
Is it taking a video or is it taking like images?
Images.
All right, thank you, Lorna. And one of the presentations for this afternoon is Jaylen, also from the Office of the Supervising Scientist. And we'll be talking a bit more about rainbows.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Peter, for the introduction. As Peter said, I work for the Supervising Scientist in Darwin, and today I'm going to talk to you about how we are assessing understory vegetation diversity of savanna woodland to inform mine site restoration within Kakadu National Park. And as you can see in that bottom image, there is no understory, so thank you for listening. What a hilarious joke that was going to be. I'd just like to thank various collaborators from the Supervising Scientist, the Centre for Mineland Rehabilitation at UQ, and the Tropical Ecosystems Research Centre at CSIRO Land and Water in Darwin. So the Alligator Rivers region is located in the Northern Territory. It includes Kakadu National Park and Western Arnhem Land. It is characterised by a strongly seasonal wet, dry tropical climate, so very distinct wet and dry seasons. During the wet season, which is between December and April, is when much of the 1,500 to 2,000 millimetres of annual rainfall occurs. And it's important to note that Kakadu is dual UN World Heritage listed for both cultural and natural categories. The Ranger Uranium Mine is scheduled to close and be rehabilitated by 2026, with operations ceasing in 2021. And under federal legislation, there are many environmental requirements, but one of them is involved with revegetation, and that is using local native plant species similar in density abundance to those existing in adjacent areas of Kakadu National Park. So by definition, this is ecological restoration, and it is stated that restoration should be done to a standard where the final landform can be incorporated into Kakadu. The supervising scientist has recently published restoration standards, which include goals or closure criteria, and one of these is for ecosystem restoration and involves understory. However, the savanna understory has received less focus over the last 40 years of the supervising scientist. So savanna woodland in Kakadu National Park is commonly reported as eucalypt overstory with the dominant species of Eucalyptus miniata and Eucalyptus tetradona over tall annual grass understory, especially sorghum species. And this vegetation type makes up almost 80% of the park. However, there's limited quantitative understory data available for the purpose of mine closure. And since the understory is a critical component of an ecosystem due to many things like habitat provision, nutrient cycling, organic matter production, fire, fuel loads, overstory regeneration, it's very important to understand these things in the context of mine restoration. So therefore, this project aimed to answer a few questions. These are: how diverse is the understory and what are the dominant families and species? What is the natural range of variability in the understory, both spatially and seasonally, and what key species drive these differences? What is the diversity of plant functional types in the understory? And ultimately, how can these quantitative measures be used to guide restoration at Ranger? We have 8 permanent plots within 10-kilometre radius of Ranger, and these sites were selected using land classification units based on the pre-disturbance topography of the mine. These are all in 1 hectare of 1 hectare size, 100 by 100 metre plots, and were sampled using the AusPlots Rangeland Survey Protocol. And as you can see in the bottom image, as an example of how the plots are set out. So there are 10 100-metre transects. At every metre along each transect, point intercept measurement was taken, so species presence and height. And from this data, we get an estimated species percentage cover per plot. And with this method, understory is defined as less than 1.5 metres, and we have currently done 1 survey of each plot during the wet season in April of this year, which was coincided with the peak biomass and peak diversity of the savanna in terms of understory. So what did we find? Coming from Perth, which is very biodiverse, I'm a bit of a biodiversity snob, so I was a bit sceptical of the brilliance of the savanna, but it was very diverse, so I was blown away. So we found 245 species from 145 genera and 68 families, and 191 of these were classed as typical understory species. So understory cover was on average 76% in each plot. And looking at that cover by family, we can see by far the most abundant family was the Poaceae, or the grasses, with all other family cover below 5%, with the Fabaceae, or the legume family, as the next most abundant family. And going further level down, looking at the species themselves, the most abundant, it's no surprise that 4 out of the 5 most abundant species were grasses, with by far the most abundant of those species being sorghum intrans, the native tall annual speargrass. The only shrub that was in the top 5 species for cover was Pedalostigma quadriloculare, or the quinine bush, and this was quite prolific in certain sites. So from these simple analyses, we have a good understanding of the total understory cover and also species-specific cover, which we can use to start to develop closure metrics and start to answer some of those, define some of the parameters in terms of the environmental requirements. And we've found that there's a very diverse but also a small number of dominant species. So looking at this data in a slightly different way, so this is an NMDS ordination, which basically assigns a similarity value to each plot and then ordinates it based on the similarities between each plot. And we found, at 50% similarity, we found 4 broad understory vegetation groups. So the most representative, which included 4 out of the 8 plots, was dominated by the tall annual grass sorghum intrans. Group B, which involved 2 plots, were dominated by the annual herb Spermacoque stenophylla. 1 plot in Group C was dominated by the Spinifex Triodia bitextura. And the last plot was dominated by the perennial grass Eriacne obtusa. So we can see that there is quite a variable understory between plots, with only 4 out of the 8 dominated by sorghum intrans, the tall annual grass. And this indicates that there is high species diversity and therefore high turnover across the landscape, so high beta diversity within the savanna. So looking at the functional traits of the understory, we found that 55% of understory cover on average is from annual species, with 40% from perennial species. So using this information, we can start to make inferences in terms of the potential fire fuel loads of these ecosystems and the nutrient cycling on organic matter, so different species with different life histories will influence these processes in different ways. So understanding this and how it varies across the landscape, as you can see, plot 10, which is dominated by the Spinifex, has quite a different proportion of life histories. And method of persistence, so 60% of the understory cover is from obligate seeding species, with 35% from resprouting species on average. And this data has implications for the potential response of the understory to disturbance like fire. So a population or a community with high or different percentages of seeding or resprouting will respond in very different ways to disturbance. So what does this mean in the broader ecological restoration context, and also specifically for Ranger? We've shown, we've given an example of how quantitative understory metrics may be derived and involved in restoration standards. I believe this is a good example of the benefits of using multiple plots within the reference ecosystem. We've shown quite a range of variability across the landscape, and without these multiple plots, you would lose some of that variability. We've also got permanent reference plots, so into the future we'll survey these across different seasons. So we'll be able to capture this temporal variability in a very heterogeneous landscape. At Ranger specifically, we now are going towards understanding the natural range of variability in the understory, both floristically and functionally. We understand, there are potential implications of introducing understory into a waste rock substrate. So one example of this is the introduction of, the trade-off between introducing an understory early for the benefits of increasing nutrient cycling and organic matter production versus introducing a potentially high fuel load with grasses and things that may have implications for a young canopy population and their resilience to fire. And this information can also be used to inform seed collection and understory trialling for the mining company. At the Supervising Scientist, as Mitch just explained, we are trying to derive vegetation closure metrics at scale. And many of the ecosystem restoration standard metrics are considered at scale where possible. And currently these methods are being developed for using drones in greater than 1 hectare areas. And so therefore we need a knowledge of the dominant or framework understory species which surround Ranger, and we've taken a good first step at defining this. However, there's a limitation of drones that, as Lorna just showed you, it's very hard to fly a drone at large scales if you want to be able to identify these understory species. So ground-based surveys will inevitably be necessary throughout the long-term monitoring. So we've taken the first step in that process. And then ultimately we'll be using ground-based surveys to inform airborne survey techniques to develop cheap and effective long-term monitoring methods. So to summarise, there's a large understory diversity in the savanna, both within plots and between plots. We've identified 4 broad vegetation understory types, and we've taken the first step into informing the collection of vegetation composition and structure data at scale with drones to inform closure metrics for Ranger. And therefore we're able to progress with the refinement and development of key indicator values for closure. I'd just like to mention that the Supervising Scientist Rehabilitation Standards have recently been published. So these are accessible publicly, openly. So if you'd like to refer to the standard that I was talking about today, or many other standards from water sediment quality through to landform, all facets of restoration, then please feel free to look at those. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Jay. Well, being lucky last, you can have at least 2 minutes for questions. And then after that, because we have nothing else to do, if people want to, they can ask any of the other speakers questions after Jay.
So, thanks for your chat. The results show a lot of complexity and what you expect. So, crystal ball into the future here, is that going to be a high standard for the mine to meet? And, is it mostly practical to get that sort of completion criteria around equal amounts of diversity in the understory there? And is there a lesson learned because of that? Is my assumption that's correct? Is there a lesson learned that this stuff now needs to be sort of integrated into the mine space? Because if we do this without complexity before the mine happens, would it have changed the way we assess and improve the mine?
Yeah, interesting question. So this data won't necessarily be the final criteria. This is just sort of a first insight. So the closure criteria are still under negotiation very much. So I really can't answer that in terms of that. Like obviously 245 species is very impractical, considering most of the species were only found in a couple of individuals in a single corner of a plot. So in terms of their importance, that's, may not be important in terms of ecosystem processes, but depends on the values of biodiversity and everything else. So it is quite complex. But I guess it's also probably quite a unique situation because it is surrounded by Kakadu, and so I guess public opinion on that may be quite a lot higher. So maybe the expectation, I guess, maybe higher compared to other mines. So I think it is quite a unique case, but I guess to answer the second question is that the more data you have, the better. So at least if you need or if you want to target in that sort of realm, then you have it. Yeah, that's all right.
So 20 kilometres over 1 mile,
Ping.
Yes, just for the presentation from Harris was talking about the surrounding area. So they haven't really considered the underlying substrate. And as we understand that the Ranger Mine, where we have taken by West of Queensland, don't have any soil alkali. There's different substrate, and that haven't been taken into consideration. So that's something when we get the coastal area, that really needs to be consideration of substrate.
There's no waste dropping surrounding. The legislation states that it has to be similar to surrounding areas.
That's right.
So
but we still mentioned the limitations we have. We are talking about rural area to have different size, but in reality, we are working with something you don't have really a reference size. So that's why in this rehabilitation standard, you have one what's called conceptual model for the reference. That has so that's our challenge. I don't think you have any successful conceptual model yet. I'm going to ask Jen, do you have any successful case of conceptual model on the outside? So we're still working on that. So it's challenging for us to develop conceptual model.
Thank you.
So the system that you're working in, from the looks of everything and from experience of the topics, getting back your dominant 4 or 5 species that are all prolifically seeding annuals that are fire responsive is probably not going to be a problem. Given that the rest of your 245 species are pretty much micro-herbaceous species that are flowering and seeding for about a month of the year in the middle of the wet season, what's the practical limitations in terms of your seed collection or restoration and how you can return, say, 200 species of microherbs that represent your 60-70% diversity?
Yeah, so I guess, we're not necessarily involved in seed collection and things. That's the mining company itself. Thank goodness, yeah. Talk to Ping about that, yeah.
I'm thinking sort of stylidium, a stylidium at scale of restoration.
Yeah, so I guess there's an element of pragmatism that needs to come into this. And this is still under negotiation and discussion. But yeah, you're right, definitely that hitting those dominant species. And in terms of moving forward with monitoring of the restoration success, then targeting those higher abundant species will be more beneficial. But yeah, we've still got to decide on where that level of pragmatism lies.
It seems like even if you were to select 20%, 30%, 50% of your overall species diversity, the vast majority of that number is going to be microherbaceous species.
Yeah. So I guess it's just a factor.
I might let Jay off the hook at this point, but in that, the questions can be to any of the speakers from this 4 or so minutes left.
Yeah.
So we used to fly autonomously, or did you do that?
So for that one, which was actually around flying the drone, but it was in an open area. So just,
Yes, mate. So just taking photos vertically at those increments based on the last. So we weren't doing any autonomous under canopy flights. Not yet.
We came across the road about 2 years ago. The collision avoidance systems were prohibitively heading for the field.
You do a specific anchors, like they go. They've got pretty good. Yeah, they're getting that. I think it's pretty close now. Yeah, it does.
one of the papers that we were looking at actually talked about flying the drones under the canopy, and but they're still testing it and it's not out available for everybody yet. But yeah, there's promise.
Just a general comments regarding my comments up there. Is regarding this not 200 species of understory species, which is in sort of model that for shorter lifespan. And this morning we have I've heard this plenary discussions regarding valuing of the natural assets. I was thinking we might also valuing the natural process. But many of the those understory species, minor species, and it's important for biodiversity. The certain play a certain ecological function, but their function might be manual as well. But I see that all the time, the natural will take their own process. We see similar animals, but bringing the seeds in and wind blowing seeds in. So it's a natural process to make it good enough to actually over time the increases biodiversity. So we probably don't need to create an environment for the vegetation of all the species of the understories. But what we need to do is to create a framework of sustainable, at least upstory and mid-story species, and also with some key understory species. But as Jay just said, one of those understories one is basically sorghum, and it don't need to do anything. It's a risk for me because it easily come in and become fire hazard. Actually, I put it as a risk. So we need certainly the cooling plants is something we are working on. We have some success already to have a cooling plant grow on the restaurant. So we are now currently doing with my colleague Megan, and she has a poster downstairs and talking about the understory tribes now. We are doing some work there. But just think about we need the value of the natural process for those species.
All right, we have 1 minute left if we want any. Go ahead.
My question is also for Lorna. The identification of flowers from geometry, I'm just wondering about the accuracy that you were able to achieve with that. Were there any cases of, I noticed that two of your three species were both white. Were there any cases where you were looking at this as a flower from this time that actually turns out you don't quite have the resolution you certain?
For that I showed, we only pretty much grabbed the pictures from those slides that we knew exactly what we were looking at. So this is not from recognition or anything like that. It's only based on those straight up slides.
So yes, there could be a lot of misidentifications of white flowers. Or pink. Or slightly green fruit. So it's now 4:30, which means we're perfectly on time, which is excellent. Tonight is an early career function. Hopefully you've replied and said that you went along, otherwise you can go off and do whatever you want. But there are free drinks and mixing.
St. Lucy at Kakadu, from campus at 600 metres walk.
And that's for the SERA meeting. So thank you all. And thank you.